Once you've decided that a free cash flow model is an appropriate valuation technique, you can then set about compiling a valuation model in Excel. This will involve forecasting financial statements over a horizon period where the company is experiencing non-constant growth, up until a point in time where the company reaches a steady state. We then use those forecast financial statements to calculate estimates of the free cash flows of the company. Once a company has reached a steady state, we can use a perpetuity to value the continuing value for the company. The continuing value is the value of the stream of free cash flows from the point in time that the company has reached a steady state onwards. We then discount the free cash flows and the continuing value to their present values at the beginning of the investment period. Finally, we add up the present value of the free cash flows and the present value of the continuing value to arrive at an overall valuation for the company. For the purpose of this series of presentations, we will compile a valuation model using a simplified 9-step process. The first step involves selecting a cash flow that is appropriate for your company. For example, free cash flow to the firm or free cash flow to equity. In the next step, we should select an appropriate discount rate for the cash flow that's been selected. In step 3, we have to think about the forecast period that will be used with the valuation model. We have to determine the length of the forecast period and the level of detail that will be used when forecasting the company's financial statements. We will discuss this more in a moment. When we build the valuation model for Tescal Limited, I will select a 10-year forecast period. This will comprise of a detailed forecast period for the initial 5 years, followed by a summarized forecast period for a further 5-year period. At this point, I will assume that Tescal reaches a steady state, and I will use a perpetuity to calculate the continuing value component of Tescal's value. The valuation model is underpinned by historical accounting data. We will use the past accounting information of the company to forecast the financial statements. And so we must compile and prepare historical accounting information for the company, say for the past 10 years. There are a variety of sources that we can access this information from. For example, financial databases such as FAME, Compustat, DataStream, or Bloomberg. We will discuss this more in a moment. The raw historical accounting data will be very detailed in nature. The past income statements and balance sheets of the company will contain a detailed number of line items. We don't need that level of detail for the purpose of valuation. The next step involves condensing down the detailed historical accounting information into a set of condensed integrated financial statements. So we compress or condense the line items in the raw historical accounting information into a reduced number of select line items in the condensed integrated financial statements. We should compress or condense them to the extent that we have the minimum number of line items that we need in order to carry out the valuation. Next, we should think about what drives each one of the line items in the condensed integrated financial statements. What factor causes or drives each line item to change? Once we've thought about and identified factors that drive each one of the line items, we can estimate forecast ratios for each line item in the condensed integrated financial statements. We then apply the forecast ratios to forecast the financial information over the detailed forecast period. Next, we used a select number of forecast ratios to forecast simplified line items over the secondary simplified forecast period. In the 8th step, we use that forecast financial information to calculate estimates of the free cash flows for the company. At this point, we should also calculate the implicit return on invested capital that we have effectively embedded in each year that we have constructed forecast financial statements for. This is necessary to check the reasonableness of the forecast financial statements. We should observe one of a few particular trends in the return on invested capital over the forecast period if the forecast financial statements are reasonable. We will discuss this more in a moment. The final step involves discounting back and adding up the free cash flows and the continuing value to arrive at an overall valuation for the company. When selecting a forecast period, we have to decide on the length of the forecast period. The length of the forecast period will depend on the expected growth pattern within the company. If the company is expected to have stable growth, then we may be better off using some sort of perpetuity to value the company. However, if the company is expected to have non-constant growth, our forecast period needs to be long enough to reach a point in time where the company has reached a steady state. If we consider a 3-stage growth pattern, our forecast period needs to be long enough for the company to reach steady state. Once the company reaches steady state, we can use a perpetuity to calculate the continuing value, or the value of the remaining free cash flows from this point in time onwards. However, during the forecast period where the company is experiencing non-constant growth, we have to forecast financial statements for each year, and we have to use these forecast financial statements to calculate estimates of free cash flow for each year over the forecast period. How detailed should the forecast financial statements be? Let's assume we're looking at a company with a 3-stage growth pattern. In the initial forecast period, we will assume that the historical accounting data has relative predictability. In other words, we're going to assume that the historical accounting data does an okay job at predicting the near-term performance and position of the company. And so over this period, we will forecast detailed financial statements. We will forecast each one of the lines in the condensed integrated financial statements over this period. In the secondary forecast period, we are attempting to forecast financial statements 6 to perhaps 15 years in the future. We are trying to look far into the future during this forecast period. And so we will assume that the historical accounting data loses its predictability when we're trying to see this far into the future. At this stage, we rarely are engaged in guesswork, and so we have to apply a particular principle. Keep it simple. During this forecast period, we only forecast the bare minimum line items that we need to calculate free cash flow. So we will use a simplified forecast for the portion of the forecast period 6 to 15 years in the future. In the final part of the forecast period, we assume the company reaches a steady state. We can use a perpetuity to calculate the continuing value of the company, or the value of the cash flows from this point in time onwards. So your forecast period must be long enough for the company to reach a steady state. What is a steady state? A steady state is defined by the following characteristics. The company grows at a constant rate and reinvests a constant proportion of its earnings back into the business. In other words, the plowback ratio is constant. In addition, the company earns a constant return on its existing invested capital and also a constant rate of return on new capital invested. In general, You should use an explicit forecast period that is 10 to 15 years in length, perhaps even longer for cyclical companies or those companies experiencing rapid growth. If you select a short explicit forecast period, say 5 years in length, this will typically result in an undervaluation or will require unrealistic long-term growth assumptions when calculating the continuing value. The valuation model is underpinned by historical accounting data. We use the past accounting information of the company when forecasting the financial statements over the forecast period. Where can you access historical accounting data on companies from? There are a variety of sources. You could manually collect the data by retrieving the financial statements of the companies from their websites and manually entering the figures in the financial statements into an Excel spreadsheet. This is not recommended because it's incredibly time-consuming. You could also retrieve the financial statements and the filings of the companies from, for example, the Companies House if it's a British company, the company's registration office if it's an Irish company, or if the company files in the United States, you could use the SEC's Edgar FTP site to access the financial statements and the filings for the company. What is recommended is if you have access to a financial database, you use the financial database to retrieve the historical accounting information. Examples of financial databases include Bloomberg, CompuStat, DataStream, and Fame.